Well, good morning, everybody, and I guess good afternoon to some of you. I need to make sure my screen is showing here. Yeah. Um, Happy Earth Day. Thank you for joining us, and thank you very much to Judson for making this possible. I'm going to be sharing today some of the material from my book, Tending to Eden, and a little bit of my own journey on how I went from being a skeptic to an activist, and how I've come to believe that mutual flourishing of the environment and of human beings is not only possible but necessary. Let's see. I'm still fighting with the screen sharing. I apologize. Does everybody see the Tending to Eden book right now?
I can see your first slide. If you could
Okay.
just put it in full slide mode.
Okay. How is that? How's that?
It's still in kind of it's not in slideshow. I'm sorry.
Oh.
So yeah, let's see.
Okay.
There we go.
Okay. Thank you. Well, my story starts about 25 years ago in Guatemala. I spent a summer doing language learning, but during that time, God literally took me by the hand and showed me the kind of thing that I had never seen before. This picture is of the Guatemala City dump and is emblematic of what I saw that summer. It was the first time I really came face to face with gross injustice, with desperate poverty, and it broke my heart. And I came away wondering, how can I help people like this young girl and her child that I saw. I was working on a graduate degree at the time and still had a semester to go, so I returned to San Diego rather than staying in Guatemala. But when I did, I was looking for ways to volunteer and ways to get involved somehow in eradicating poverty, and I found Plant with Purpose as a small San Diego nonprofit at the time, started volunteering there, and very quickly learned that, believe it or not, the environment has something to do with this picture. In addition to just the horrible and awful pollution that these people are living with, it was actually upstream environmental degradation that had brought so many of them there. Like I say, I was a skeptic at the time. I was very interested in poverty alleviation, but the tree planting aspect of what Plant with Purpose was doing kind of seemed odd. In fact, I remember when I first started working at Plant with Purpose, my father said, seriously, planting trees for Jesus? That's about as marginal as you can get. But the more I learned about what we were doing, the more necessary I saw it to be. This is a picture of downtown Port-au-Prince. We've been working in Haiti now since 1995. You look at a picture like this, and it looks pretty awful. But the remarkable thing about this picture is, for millions of Haitians, it actually represents hope. People are trying to get there, and the more we talk to people in places like this, the more we realize that almost all of them were recent migrants from the countryside. They'd come to places like this looking for a better life. They come to places like this because this is where they could find schools and they could find jobs. And as they told us over and over again, there is no hope in the countryside. There is no future in the countryside. So we followed this problem upstream to the countryside, up the rivers and up into the mountains where the people had come from, and found farmers. Now, when I say farmers to an American audience, there's often a mental image that looks something like this. You might have a picture of a tractor or a combine in a flat field working with a single crop, probably a man driving that combine, or the windrower in that case. And that is certainly one type of farmer, but the type of farmer that we met was different in almost every way. This picture of Nelly de Siem from Haiti, is sort of emblematic of that. First of all, she's not driving a tractor. In fact, she doesn't even have animals for traction. She's using hand tools. Secondly, as you can see, it's not a man, it's a woman, and probably 70% of the farmers we work with are women. I just came back from the DRC, from the Democratic Republic of Congo, and was once again reminded about how much of the food is grown and how much of the farming is done by women. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later. So rather than a man, you have a woman. Rather than a tractor, you have hand tools. And she's certainly not growing a single cash crop on flat land. If you take a look at that, she's probably growing 3 or 4 crops on very steep land. There's a couple other things you can see in this picture. One is that land is badly degraded. You can see that the soil has been eroded, that it's very dry, few water resources, certainly no irrigation. And the other thing, and I'm projecting a little bit on Nelly here, but she looks tired and maybe a little discouraged. And one of the things that we found out in general is farmers tend to be very disempowered. The other thing that I was shocked to learn, and many people are shocked to learn, is that nearly 1 billion people make their living this way as subsistence farmers, eating only what they grow and growing almost all that they eat. It's a lifestyle that's almost completely hidden from us here in the industrialized West, but nearly 1 out of every 7 people in the world survive this way. Not only that, but they are the poorest people in the world. Of the 840 million chronically hungry people in the world, that is the people who never get enough calories, 80% of those are subsistence farmers. Let that sink in for just a moment. 80% of the people who don't get enough to eat are the people trying to grow their own food. And just to put a little bit of a picture on this, like I say, we just began working in the Democratic Republic of Congo. We did a baseline study there and found that the average person in that region eats 1.3 meals per day. 95% of them had gone a full 24 hours in the previous month without eating. Some of the hungriest people in the world, and they're completely dependent on their own hands and this land for their survival. The other thing that we found out was that there was a vicious cycle that was taking place between land degradation, in this case particularly deforestation, and increasing poverty. And I want to spend a little bit of time unpacking that, because it's understanding that dynamic that's the key to understanding what we've tried to do and how we've come to the conclusion that mutual flourishing is necessary. One of the things that we learned, and that I was shocked to find out, is that poverty leads to deforestation. In fact, it's the #1 cause of deforestation worldwide. It contributes to it through the use of charcoal and firewood, which provides the vast majority of the energy requirements for lots of places in the world. In Haiti, in sub-Saharan Africa, in Somalia, charcoal is as important to the economy as oil is to our own. It provides all of the cooking and all of the heating material. Shifting agriculture or slash and burn farming is another major contributor. In fact, it's the single largest contributor to deforestation. And as people are poor and don't have ownership of their own land, they frequently have no incentive to invest in its long-term health. So land tenure is a big player. And then finally, the lack of a safety net. When people are desperate, they'll do desperate things. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later, but there have been some amazing stories I've heard of people basically forced to cut down their fruit trees in order to survive today rather than wait till the fruit can ripen 2 months down the road. I want to go back to slash and burn farming for just a second. The more proper name for that, the better term for that is swidden agriculture. And basically that's a form of shifting agriculture that's very traditional and is actually sustainable if it's practiced in in areas where the population is not particularly dense. There was a recent National Geographic article, which I'm happy to send to anybody who's interested, looking at sustainable swidden agriculture. But as people have been forced into more marginalized lands, into hillsides, and into areas that are more dense, it becomes less sustainable. The picture in the back of this slide is actually an example from Chiapas of slash and burn farming, where this area of rainforest has just been cut and burned, which releases some nutrients into the soil. They'll be able to farm this for about 2 years or 3 years before they have to move on and move deeper into the rainforest. Now, one of the things I want to say as a bit of a disclaimer is poor farmers are by no means the only contributors to deforestation. There's certainly logging and large-scale grazing and so forth. And it's very easy to blame these people, but that's really blaming the victims. I mean, they have little choice and little opportunity. Anyway, I want to really hit that point because I think when we look at causes of deforestation, it's easy to say, well, it's ignorant people, but it's really not. It's people who lack opportunity and people who've been forced into a very difficult situation. I want to share with you this story. This is from Oaxaca, Mexico. I mentioned charcoal. I mentioned its importance to the economy. It's not only important in terms of fuel supply, but it's also important in terms of income to the communities. This particular community, I took this picture, was the town of La Maraya, and the mayor there told me that literally the only cash that had ever come into that town was from sales of charcoal. They grew corn, they grew beans for their own consumption, but for cash it was charcoal. And as you can see, it's a family enterprise. The entire family, including the 5-year-old and the 7-year-old, are there making charcoal. They were able to make about $200 a year bagging and selling charcoal. And the people aren't stupid. Right next door are communities where there is no forest, where the land has basically been turned into a desert. And many of them told me, we know that's the future if we keep going this way. But again, with few other alternatives, this is what they chose to do. The flip side of that is as the land becomes deforested, as the land turns into a desert, it increases poverty. If you think back to Nellie, the Haitian farmer, what are the assets that she has? What does she have to make her way in the world? And really, she only has two: her soil and whatever water happens to fall on that, whatever in the form of rain. And both of those are very quickly taken away as the land degrades, and specifically as the land is deforested. Deforestation leads to massively increased soil erosion, up to 75 times faster. And if you think that soil isn't just dirt, that is the wealth that she has. It is her lifeblood, literally, and that goes away up to 75 times faster. So does the water. And this is something that's taken me years to fully wrap my brain around. But as the land is degraded, springs and rivers dry up, the aquifers dry, and water contamination increases. The next slide shows that. Take a few minutes to look at this because it shows it in a way that is difficult for me to explain. But one of the easiest ways to think of the forest, to think of trees, to think of vegetation, is it acts as a sponge. Yeah, it uses some of the water, but it also breaks up the rainfall, allows it to infiltrate into the soil, replenish the water table, and then slowly feed the rivers and springs so that those flow year-round. When you remove that vegetation, and there's nothing to slow the rainfall and no sponge to allow it to slowly soak in, it runs off. That's where you get catastrophic flooding, where something that was life-giving in terms of that river or that spring goes from being life-giving to a death trap. And I can tell you about dozens of communities where they were once bisected by a gentle flowing brook that are now cut through by a dry wash hundreds of yards wide. In one particular town we work in Haiti, one night in 2004, nearly 2,000 people were killed as the river above turned into a raging torrent of mud and swept through the center of this town. The beautiful thing about this picture, you know, the top is really before, the bottom is after, is it can be reversed. We can work with land like the bottom and turn it into land like the top. It's actually, to say it's easy is probably an overstatement, but it's remarkably resilient. And if we can begin to farm in ways that start to replenish that vegetation, the rivers and streams come back, and we've seen that. We actually are getting more involved in water quality monitoring and water flow measurement to measure that and see how that's taking place in the watersheds that we're working in. One of the other things I want to emphasize about this is that various ministries and aid agencies have spent an awful lot of time on drilling water wells, and that's great, and there's nothing wrong with that. But very few have looked at how do we restore the watershed that water well is in. As you can see in this, water wells dry up when the watershed isn't taken care of, and water wells can be replenished when the watershed is restored. I really like the idea of getting at the root causes. You know, again, when I came to all this, I was both skeptical and didn't understand this. I don't think, and maybe it's a little esoteric, but I think that it's important to see, because this is where things like tree planting to address the needs of the poor start to make sense. You know, one of the questions I get asked all the time is, so then your role is to go tell people that they shouldn't cut their trees, or your role is to go teach farmers in Haiti how to farm. And I have to laugh about that a little bit. I did once work on a farm in college. It was the one job I've ever been fired from. It had something to do with a burning tractor. But so no, I don't teach anybody how to farm. I also don't tell people that they shouldn't cut trees. For the most part, people know. I have had illiterate Haitian farmers explain how a watershed functions and explain some of the things that I was just talking about with more eloquence than American biology professors, but they always end that explanation with, but I have to eat. How am I going to feed my kids? How am I going to feed my kids? So unless we address both the issue of poverty and the issue of environment, then we cannot meet the needs of the people. So the question then is what do we do? How do we begin to meet those needs? You know, I think the world is moving away from the idea of just giving things away. Maybe not. I still meet people all the time who want to send their old clothes or that sort of thing. But one of the very first things I learned 20 years ago is the best of intentions often take you in a very difficult direction. This is Haiti. This was a donated tractor, almost new, had very few hours on it, and as you can probably tell, has not been used real recently. except maybe as a germination bed for some plants. But, you know, I look at the church group who raised money for that and I think, wow, some of the best of intentions have gone awry here. And we have to realize that even if, as we talk to local communities, we're coming in, whether we know it or realize it or not, from a position of power. And if we say, would you guys like a new tractor? Nobody's going to say no to you. But if we don't listen to what they really need and what what's really holding them back, we can really easily end up with a situation like that. That's why for us, one of the key things to start has been the idea of participatory community development, getting the community and the local people to participate in designing the processes for changing their own situation, developing some ownership for what's going on, and as much as possible, designing and implementing the solutions. I'll share with you a real early story. When I learned this, was in one of my first visits to Haiti in about 1997, 98. We were walking up to a community called Kavanak, and we arrived at a meeting of farmers. It was this particular background in this picture is actually Tanzania, but it was a meeting not too different from this. There was about 30 people there, most of whom were very, very discouraged. You know, several of them afterwards and beforehand came up and asked me for food. But during the course of the meeting, a woman stood up, Madame Forville, really remarkable person, somebody that, well, I haven't seen her in a number of years, but somebody that we are still in touch with. But she stood up in an almost confrontational way. She said, listen, you know, Group X has been here, and they gave us things, and they're gone. And Group Y was here, and they gave us stuff, and they're gone. And how are you going to be any different? And I consulted for just a second with our Haitian director, Dezo, and said, well, first of all, we're not going to give anything away. Secondly, we're not going to go away. We're not going to leave until you're ready for us to leave. And I got on the airplane the next day and did go away back to San Diego. But Dezo, and this is the beautiful thing of our local partners being in the communities day in and day out, and Dezo and his team continued to work with her, didn't go away. And I was blessed to come back about 2 years later and have her stand up again in front of the group and say, we get it. What you have given us is the knowledge that we're not helpless, that God has given us talents that we can use to change our own situation. And then they proceeded to show us how they'd put their talents to work in terms of starting fruit tree orchards and building cisterns and microfinance systems, so forth. It was amazing to see all that they'd accomplished in a short time. And I think that that is really key. That's why I talk about it first in terms of the things we do, is helping people to understand the talents that they have, that God gives everybody a role to play in His kingdom. There are things, some very specific talents that God has given us too, and one of those is in the area of sustainable agriculture and agroecology and various forms of farming that start to rebuild that ecosystem. If you think back again to the slide of Nellie in Haiti and that barren hillside she's working with, the water no longer infiltrates the soil, it's dried out. If we can farm in a way that it starts to look like a forest, those things will start to happen again. And this is an example from Tanzania, but it's a perfect example of that style of farming, of agroforestry. The farmer in this case is farming on 4 different levels. They have root crops, things like taro and sweet potato growing on the bottom level. You can see that there. And the next level up is coffee. The level above that is bananas, and then above that they have fruit trees and trees for timber and fodder trees and so forth that provide shade. So they're taking advantage of multiple layers on their farm. They're focusing on perennials rather than annuals, and they're focusing on a diversity of crops that will begin to do what the natural ecosystem would do, and to work with the land instead of against the land. Well, we've recently measured and found out that on average in some of our programs, we haven't conducted this study in all of our programs yet, but usually people can get about an 80% increase in crop yields within a few years. Farming like this, the soil is restored, the land's restored, and it's sustainable. It's not something that they're going to have to move on from in 2 years. Just a slide showing some of the examples of farm production and some of the ways that it all feeds in. And we talk a lot in our literature and our website about the trees that have been planted, 18 million trees that have been planted. The exciting thing about that is it's not us, it's not our staff that's planted those trees. It's people like Bariki in the center of this slide who planted those trees, both to restore his farm, and then as he begins to get some traction to restore the land that above his farm, the land that his farm depends on, the watershed that it flows from. That addresses some of the environmental aspects, but addressing the poverty aspect, we have begun using a new tool called Village Savings and Loan Associations, and I'm so excited about this. We started doing it in 2007. It was our director in Tanzania, local person, actually jumping back 3 slides, this woman here first came across the Village Savings and Loan System in Tanzania and began to incorporate it. And I have to tell you, I was a skeptic when I first heard about it. I guess that's maybe an ongoing theme, as I tend to be a skeptic. But much like microfinance, it makes small loans available for poor people. If you're familiar at all with microfinance system, using which loans of $100 or $200 are made to poor people who are in solidarity groups, and they invest those in small enterprises. This is similar, but different in some key ways. First of all, we provide no money for loans. That all comes from their savings. That's why I was skeptical. I looked at the people and I thought, they can't save. And certainly when we start talking to groups, they're often skeptical. They often say, look, we don't have 2 nickels to rub together. How are we going to save? But they go through an intensive 12-week training program. They decide how much they can save, and everybody can save something. Even if it's, I've heard of groups that have started with as little as $0.10 a week, more frequently 50 cents or $1 a week. And each week when they come to the training, they purchase shares, between 1 and 5 shares at whatever savings amount that they've decided. If it's $1, a share would cost $1, 5 shares would cost $5. And at the end of their training, if you have 30 people in a group pooling their money, and at the end of that time, if they're averaging $2 a week, you've got $700, which becomes the capital for lending. The group lends it to group members. They decide unanimously who's going to receive the loan. They all have an interest in that success of that loan. And the interest on it accrues to the shareholders, accrues to the savings account. And that's where I think it's so much more exciting and so much more beautiful than traditional microfinance. In traditional microfinance, the interest would go to pay our overhead, maybe go to pay part of my salary and part of the loan officer's efforts out there. In this case, the interest stays in the community, and that money continues to grow and grow and grow. So I visited a group like this one. This is a Haitian group, but it was a Dominican group a couple years ago, and they were telling me their story, and they said at the end of a year they cashed out, and all the groups have this moment at the end of a year in which everybody receives their shares back with interest. And they said, we couldn't believe that between us we had $4,000, and what's more, every last peso was accounted for. We never in our wildest dreams imagined that this community was capable of that. Now, I didn't understand when we first started this, the purpose of the cashing out. But one of the things it did was it created confidence and allowed people to hold in their hands and tangibly see the results of their savings. So when we started a second cycle, they had the opportunity to reinvest. And this particular group just went wild. When I visited it about 6 months into their second cycle, they had $12,000. Their entire conception of who they were as a community changed. First of all, they told me that people had stopped drinking so that they could save. They stopped gambling so they could save. One woman told me, the only thing that we feel bad about is we've had these resources all along and we never realized it. But now we know that we have in our power the ability to change our community. It's just been a tremendous thing. Like I say, in 2007, when we were experimenting with it, I was a little bit of a skeptic. In 2009, 2010, I finally started to believe, and we started trying it elsewhere. And since 2010, 2011, we have 1,000 of these groups. And they've built a combined equity of over $2.2 million. It's $2.2 million that's being turned over and over again, used and invested in these communities by people who didn't believe that they could save 50 cents or a dime a week. It's just been, anyway, I'm sorry, I could go on and gush about this because it has really been exciting. The third piece, environmental restoration, economic empowerment is spiritual renewal, and that's been an important part of helping people to see God's plan in all of this, to understand that God gives them talents. A particular aspect of that I've become very excited about is something that we, again, one of our local directors, in this case in Burundi, started, was a program called Theology of Work. At the time, we were working with a lot of returning refugees in Burundi, people who'd spent, in some cases, decades in refugee camps, and really not only had never been given the chance to do anything productive, but didn't understand or saw work as a curse. And the understanding that God loves them, gives them purpose and vocation, calling, asks them to use their talents for God's kingdom, has been an eye-opener for the local churches. I just saw this past week in Congo in ways that I couldn't have imagined. Sadly, traditionally, the women do all of the farm work, and a lot of the men, they've either been involved in fighting as combatants, or as one man told me, I mean, literally, his words were, "We used to sit around in the house and play cards all day, but now we're understanding that God gives us work to do to glorify Him, and we're helping our wives in the farms." And we saw that, which may not sound like much, but for those who've traveled in places like Congo, to see men out at work in the field alongside their wives is a culture changer, and is really exciting. So I'm really excited about how the theology of work and how spiritual renewal in general folds into the whole program. What we've seen, these three areas, the environmental restoration, economic empowerment, spiritual renewal, they're all good by themselves. They all have impact by themselves. But when they're brought together, something really remarkable happens, and the sum is greater than the whole of parts in phenomenal ways. Actually, Linda mentioned at the beginning that we're working in 6 countries, but Congo is our 7th, and it was fun to be there. In my first trip there, I'll share with you a little bit more about that. But in July, we started working in Congo. I just list these here in this order, partly because it's the order that we got started, kind of in chronological order. And the impact, we're now serving about 145,000 people in over 400 villages. We just surpassed 1,000 village savings groups, and the people, again, it's not us, it's the people themselves, have planted 18 million trees. One of the things I love about that is it's a bit of a kingdom illustration where the very people who were vilified for deforestation, the last to become the first, as they're leading the way in restoration of the planet, and I love that fact. The other thing I really like is that so much of this is in Scripture, is foreshadowed in Scripture. When I first got involved in environmental stewardship, I moved from skeptic to utilitarian. I remember the director of a foundation asking, very conservative foundation, saying to me, I hope you're not about to tell me that God cares as much about trees as he does about people. And my response, rather flippant response at the time, was, I won't tell you that, but I will tell you is the people need the trees. Which is true, but it's very utilitarian. What I've learned in the 20 years since is that God does care about the trees for his own sake. He cares about his creation, and you can see that throughout Scripture. I learned that, and you see it all the way from Genesis, where God says repeatedly, creation is good, and he puts Adam in the garden to tend it and to keep it, and invites Adam to participate from that very first day, all the way through to where Paul says that Jesus is reconciling all things, and then later that he's given us the ministry of reconciliation. So we participate with God in tending to Eden and taking care of his creation and stewarding his creation. This particular scripture on this slide I bring up because it, in almost eerie ways, foreshadows what we're trying to do. In this passage, God, speaking through the prophet Isaiah, says, the poor and needy search for water, but there is none. I, the Lord, will answer them. I'll make rivers flow on barren heights and springs within the valleys. I'll put in the desert the cedar and the acacia, the myrtle and the olive. I'll set pines in the wasteland, the fir and the cypress together, so that people may see and know that the hand of the Lord has done this. In this passage, God starts with the same problem that we're talking about, the problem of the poor and the needy, and specifically the fact that they lack water and water resources. So God's response is to open springs in the watershed, springs in the valleys, and then planting trees. And I've shortened this up just for sake of space, but he goes on and on to talk about all the trees that he planted, and to what end? Ultimately to bring glory to God. And we see this really as the calling that Plant with Purpose has been involved in. Now, all of this so far I've talked about is a little bit of my journey and Plant with Purpose's journey, and how we see that in order to help the people to flourish, creation has to flourish. In order for creation to flourish, the people have to. But there's so many things that apply, I think, on a broader scale. You know, when I first was asked to put together this book, I was asked to look at both domestic and global environmental issues. And one of the things that I hear over and over again is what we do is so small in the face of global problems. If you spend much time looking at global environmental issues, it's very easy to become discouraged. And by the way, I think that there's a couple things that we have to offer as Christians that are unique. One is we have a hope, and the other is we have a role to play, that God calls us to be involved in his work of redemption and restoration. And both of those things give me hope. But you you spend much time looking at environmental issues and you see that degradation is everywhere. Some of the key issues that we're facing, obviously deforestation is one that we've chosen to work on and is a problem globally. It's very easy to think of it as a problem maybe only in the Amazon or in select places, but it's a massive problem on a global scale. Climate change is another one, and that's something that certainly impacts all the people we serve. A colleague of mine a number of years ago who's involved in a worldwide network of smallholder farmers said to me that every place in their network they're reporting difficulty where they depend on the rain, where they depend on the regularity of the rain for survival, where they depend on seasons. People are struggling in ways they never have before. Loss of biodiversity, soil erosion, the degradation of the oceans and the water. It can become overwhelming very quickly, but we do have a hope. We do have a role to play. And I think that our role can be likened to the story of Jesus feeding the 5,000. Similarly there, the problem that the disciples bring to Jesus is overwhelming. They've got 5,000, the Bible says 5,000 men plus women and children. So I don't know, 15,000 people, 20,000 people. The disciples come to Jesus and say, the people are hungry. And Jesus turns back to them and says, you feed them. And I can imagine the disciples just feeling utterly overwhelmed by that. But they take a step in faith and say, okay, well, what do we have to work with? Where do we start? And in one of the accounts, it talks about them finding a small boy with 5 loaves and 2 fish. And again, I think about how he must have felt. Possibly ridiculous. I remember in a Sunday school class when I was a kid them saying, well, maybe he didn't want to give away his lunch. But I think more likely he felt, wow, I have nothing to offer. Look at this huge crowd. I have 5 loaves and 2 fish. If I say anything, people are going to laugh at me. That's ridiculous. But Jesus uses that and multiplies it and it becomes the raw material for a miracle. It was both utterly inadequate and everything that this little boy had. And I think that that's the place we're in. What we can do to respond is utterly inadequate, and yet can be the raw material for a miracle. And we've seen that. The place we're most likely to begin responding is in our own neighborhoods, through little things, things like recycling and planting gardens and driving less and buying food locally and so forth. There's so many things we can do. They all seem utterly inadequate, and they are. But we have a hope in Jesus, I think, that's exciting. Our neighborhoods are not immune from degradation. It's where most of our actions will take place. I will share with you one thing that I've learned when we talk about neighborhood initiatives is to partner with others. Our church has on occasion done cleanups, and it's very easy to just go out and say, okay, we're going to go clean up the beach. And the very first time we ever did that, there were 2 other groups cleaning up the same beach at the same time, and we were fighting over gum wrappers. But in the meantime, there's secular groups and so many other people that we can collaborate with to get out in the community and make our actions part of a greater whole. So I would just say partnering with others, collaborating with others, being visible is an important thing. There's a number of principles that we've learned through Plant with Purpose that I think we can apply to. One is that diversity is important. God has given us an incredibly diverse creation. It's tempting to look for a silver bullet or a single action, a single thing that's going to fix it all. But I think it's a combination of things, and we've learned that on farms. People over the years ask me, so are you planting that miracle tree? And I'm always wondering which one they're talking about, because that miracle tree has changed probably half a dozen times in the 20 years I've been working. People are always trying to find the next silver bullet, the thing that's going to fix it all, when what seems to work is a lot of small actions multiplied. Certainly, you know, if we can take a lesson from the savings groups and apply that to creation care or environmental stewardship, nobody believed that their 50 cents would amount to anything. Nobody believed that their dime savings would amount to anything. But as they applied that in collaboration and together, it was multiplied and became something huge. The virtuous cycles, I think, is another important principle. Too often we think of the environment and people being in competition with each other. You know, people ask me all the time, so who are you going to take care of, the land or the people? And the answer is both. There can be a virtuous cycle there. We can look for how does taking care of the people benefit the land, how does taking care of the land benefit the people. More than good intentions. You know, I've spent 23 years now trying to figure out how to do this best. I'm continually learning more and learning that many of the things that we tried in the first days probably weren't really helpful. And Bryant Myers, who used to be with World Vision for many years, has said that the poor deserve better than well-intentioned amateurs. I think it's important to look at how we can do good well. And part of that's humility. We don't have the answers. Local people have the answers. Other organizations have the answers. God has the answers. We have to be humble enough to be open to all of that. Local ownership and local participation are really important. Collaboration I already mentioned in terms of collaborating with other organizations, collaborating with the community, or as I mentioned in you know, even doing a cleanup or a stream restoration in our own neighborhood, collaborating with the local environmental organizations that may already be doing that. There's an example I give in my book, but a church out of Boise, the Boise Vineyard, that became the #1 and best volunteer source for the national forests, providing assistance on trails and so forth. And then 5 loaves and 2 fish, which I've already shared. But the little can become much when we do it consistently and in faith. I'm going to skip through this. I think I'll go real well. This is an example of church doing a little and having it grow to be much. This is an area around Mount Kilimanjaro, and I showed this slide years ago in a conference in Kenya. A local pastor, a Tanzanian pastor, saw it, came up to me afterwards and he said, when you showed that slide, I was impressed, because that's the land that God has given us to take care of. He came back and started a tree nursery at his church, and then challenged the other churches in their district to create tree nurseries and to make tree planting a part of the confirmation process for their church. And that has grown to become a policy of the National Lutheran Church in Tanzania. And they've together planted hundreds of thousands of trees, starting from the initiative of a single pastor who maybe thought that his 5 loaves didn't amount to much. So our 5 loaves, as I mentioned, some real simple and small things, buying less, reducing food waste. Man, that's one that hits home with my kids and my family. Choosing less packaging, recycling, driving less. Eat locally. The last thing I'm going to remember, make it fun. It's really easy to become an environmental Pharisee. And a good friend of mine was once asked, Rusty Pritchard was once asked, what's the best way to get started in environmental stewardship? And his answer is, put out a bird feeder. Make it fun. Start to enjoy creation. The idea is not to become legalistic and bound to this. This is the Kakumba watershed where I was last week, and I just want to share a little bit of that with you. But it was amazing experience, I think, in 20 years of visiting our projects. This was one of the most remarkable, and partly because since we took a watershed, an ecological unit to start working in, 6 communities, about 5,000 people, it unites those communities in a way that they've not been united before. They come from different ethnic groups. Many of the villages have actually been at war with each other. And now as they're working together, there's a peace and reconciliation component that's come out that's been just remarkable. We hiked from the bottom of the watershed to the top, and by the time we got to the top, we had 46 people who camped with us in the forest at the top of the watershed. Among them, 5 village chiefs, people from 6 different tribes, pastors, and all of them talked about how this was an unprecedented opportunity to be together. Here's a couple real simple things that you can do. I am going to leave that up and see if there's any questions, because I've just about run out of time and I want to make sure that there's a chance to answer a few questions.
Thank you, Scott. So if you have a question for Scott at this time, please type it in the chat box or the question box, or raise your hand using the application. So at this time, Scott, I do not have any questions from the audience. So if you'd like to go through this slide out, I'm sorry, I spoke too quickly. Let's see. So the question is, where do you start planting? In the bottom near the dry river or on the top of the hill?
Great question. The answer is we should start at the top. But we work with the local farmers and the people, and so if you have somebody working at the bottom near the river and they're fired up for what we're doing and they want to start planting, that's where you start. Ecologically, it makes sense to work from the top down, but we work with the people who want to work in this, and so it's not always that neat. But great question.
Is there another question?
If people are thinking of questions, that's great. I'm going to talk through the slide, but
Okay.
I just, one of the things is, one of the things that you can do, definitely in the 5 loaves and 2 fish category, but a very important one is encouraging creation care in your congregation. There's a number of churches that we work with that have creation care committees or green teams or environmental stewardship groups. Everything's more fun with friends. We can help to resource that if you're interested, either through suggestions of books and contacts and connections or directly. Would love to help you get involved by spreading the word about the work that we do. I think we I think we have something really exciting going on, but it's not always well known. And so we'd love to have you spread the word via social media, via word of mouth. Almost everybody who supports our work has come to us via word of mouth. So we count on people like you. A real easy way to get involved financially at the kind of the basic level is our Route 7 program. $7, plant 7 trees in 7 countries. $7 per month, plant 7 trees in 7 countries, and we'd love to have people involved with that. And we've got a lot more at the website, so please follow up. Feel free to reach out to me directly, and I look forward to being in touch with you.
Scott, I do have a question. I'm going to open up the line to Trevor. Trevor? Hi, Trevor. You're currently muted if you'd like to talk with Scott. Okay. I'm unable to hear him. So we do have a question of, do you have any before and after pics?
We do. I don't have a good one in this slideshow, but I do, and I can send one out.
So maybe I can send that with the follow-up email that contains the webinar.
Uh-huh.
Okay, perfect. Okay, so we are coming upon the 2 o'clock hour, and the slide that's showing, it's Scott's book, Tending to Eden, Environmental Stewardship for God's People, which is available, and you can order online at judsonpress.com, and you'll receive a 20% discount. As Scott mentioned, you can find his website, plantwithpurpose.org, and you can also find them on Facebook and Twitter with @PlantWPurpose. Any closing thoughts, Scott, before we end the webinar?
Well, again, I'd just like to invite anybody who has further questions to get in touch with me directly. Would like to thank people for being online and staying with us, and would like to thank Judson Press and you, Linda, for the opportunity to share.
Well, thank you. The slideshow and the presentation was very interesting. Your story is very emotional, and it's just a wonderful work that your organization is doing. I also want to invite all of the attendees to keep abreast of our other webinars that we have coming up. You can do that by joining Judson Press's mailing list, or by liking us on Facebook, or keeping in touch with us through Twitter. And so with that, thank you all for your participation, and enjoy the rest of your day.